In the 1970s, a house in Connecticut gained worldwide recognition for a supposed haunting. Things got so crazy that large crowds gathered outside, and police even went on record saying that they saw furniture floating. Well, everyone who was ever involved in that case has since passed on. Everyone, that is, except for this controversial new figure named Joey. And in this report, we got an in-person interview with Joey. For 3 days in 1974, the activity of a house in Bridgeport, Connecticut, baffled citizens. And since Amy and I live just a couple of states away, we thought that we'd visit the house for the 50th anniversary of the haunting.
It was Sunday, November 24th, 1974, 50 years ago to the day, and this entire street was filled up with people. Some sources say there was as many as 1,000 people in the street, and they were all looking at this house.
Beginning in the late 60s and then culminating in November of 1974, poltergeist activity at 966 Lindley Street seemed to have just sprung up out of nowhere. And then, as mysteriously as it arrived, it just faded into nothingness. Over the years, people have proposed different theories as to what exactly caused the haunting, ranging from the death of a child to the adoption of another. But none seem to be as interesting as the one that was put forth by a man named Paul Eno. Paul was one of the very few people that was inside the house during the most active moments of the haunting. And he claimed that he felt something. He felt something physical and bony that no one else did. What he felt eventually led him on a journey trying to understand the stranger cases of the paranormal. And after decades of study, he came to the conclusion that poltergeist activity was just a smaller part of a much larger picture.
These entities feed upon certain energies produced by humans and others when a state of anger, fear, hatred, isolation, and other divisive conditions. They often work in packs. They learn quickly. They have leadership, and I've seen them farming individuals, families, and even communities as food sources, sometimes for generations. The more they eat, the stronger they get. Given our very limited framework of knowledge, I can see how these parasites easily joined human folklore early on as demons, vampires, and even space aliens.
What exactly did Paul Eno feel in that house? What theory did he eventually come up with as to the cause of the haunting? In this video, we're going to consider the possibility that there just might be real physical entities out there that live in another dimension and feed on negative human emotions. And to do this, we'll be sharing the story of the Lindley Street haunting. And to highlight Paul's theory, we'll first need to give a quick backstory on the family, how they experienced a traumatic loss before the haunting, and how that just might have prepared their minds for our parasitic presence to enter their lives. Then we'll share highlights of the haunting itself and how dozens of people witnessed these events that seemingly defy logical explanation. And finally, we'll dive into the controversial story of a man who claims that he was there 50 years ago as a child and witnessed these events firsthand. And this is not Paul Eno. Paul Eno and everyone traditionally associated with this haunting has since passed away. But recently, this person has come out of the woodwork claiming that he's the last surviving victim of this haunting. And we were able to get an in-person interview with this man. And the way he tells his story just might give some credence to Paul Eno's theory. He claims that these dark entities stayed with him nearly his entire life. This was an extremely interesting interview. Then stay with us for our Fact or Fiction segment. There, I'm going to take just a minute and give my thoughts on this case, the house, and this mysterious man that we interviewed. And then Amy is going to come on, and she's going to share information from ancient writings that depict otherworldly beings and seem to match the ones in Paul Eno's theory. So, this report begins in the early 1900s. Gerard Joseph Goodin, or Jerry, was born to Frank and Lydia Goodin less than 6 months after the end of World War I on June 19, 1919, and he spent his childhood years in the Roaring Twenties. He grew up with two younger brothers, Ernest and Joseph. After high school, he joined the Air Force, and then he became a maintenance man for the Harvey Hubble Company. His friends said that he was practical, caring, and down to earth, a devout Catholic who stayed close to his brothers as he got older. He remained single in his 20s and 30s, not finding the love of his life until he was older. Laura Martha Roberts, a Native American, was born on July 6, 1924, and she grew up as an only child, and not having any other children to play with, she looked forward to the day that she would meet the man of her dreams and have children of her own. The two met, made a solid connection, and they were married in February of 1960. Shortly after the wedding, they bought a tiny ranch house at 966 Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And less than 9 months later, on October 31st, 1960, Gerard Jr. was born. By all indications, this was a very happy time in the couple's lives. And Laura, well, she was especially happy. Unfortunately, her happiness wouldn't last. Not long after Gerard Jr. was born, he was diagnosed with cerebral palsy, and although his parents provided the very best care that they could, he died just a few short years later, on Wednesday, September 27, 1967. To make matters worse, Laura herself had medical challenges where a tumor was found and she had to have a hysterectomy, and that removed any possibility of her having any more children. Some people who have studied this case believe that these tragic events eventually catapulted Laura into an unhealthy obsession to bring another child into the home. After the funeral, Jerry and Laura set up a small shrine to their son in the corner of their house. They would relive their feelings of loss whenever they saw it, and they would visit the gravesite as often as they could. Then, about 6 months later, Laura looked at the shrine and decided it was time to move on. She and Jerry dismantled it that very night and immediately looked into adoption. They quickly made a connection with an adoption agency in Stamford, Connecticut. Shortly after that, they were given a photograph of a little girl who lived in Canada and needed a home, and the adoption process was started. Reportedly, Laura's favorite saying during this time was, "A home without a child just isn't a home." Then, in May of 1968, the adoption agency phoned and they said that it was time to pick up the little girl. And although the Goodins really didn't have the financial means to make such a long drive, they packed up anyway and headed to Canada.
The moment I got the news at 10 a.m., I grabbed my coat and my hat and I left the shop and I told people, "I'm going to Canada. Goodbye, good luck, God bless." I only had $30 or $40 in my pocket. As I ran by, people asked me if I needed money. People gave me, it must have been $100.
Jerry swung by the house, picked up Laura, and they were off.
I drove up on 2 cylinders out of the 6. They said I would never make it. It took me 18 hours.
The Goodins were introduced to a 4-year-old Native American named Marcia. Some sources say that she was reluctant. Other sources say that she ran straight to the Goodins' arms as soon as they arrived. Either way, the adoption process was a success. And even though the house was small, Jerry knocked out a wall in one of the closets and made enough space for Marcia to have a bed and some personal items. In the beginning, at least from the outside looking in, it appeared that the three of them had a strong, loving connection. But as time went by, it became more and more apparent that Laura was obsessively overprotective, and she wouldn't let Marcia out of her sight. Before she was adopted, Marcia herself had come from an extremely abusive environment, giving her a very troubled mind. After years of studying this case, these factors, among others, led a man named Paul Eno to believe that the Goodin family members didn't suffer a haunting as much as they became victims of parasitic entities that live just outside of our universe.
Several ducks have to be in a row for parasite activity to develop to the point of poltergeist activity. In the case of the Goodin family, we have a highly introverted 10-year-old in the arms of overprotective parents who feared losing her as they'd lost their first child. It was clear to me that this was a house full of anxiety and fear, even without poltergeist activity. The Goodins' spirituality was an old Roman Catholic variety that I feel was very negative, based on fear rather than love.
The haunting at Lindley Street became famous in 1974, but the paranormal activity actually began years earlier, and some of it was even witnessed by neighbors, like the time that the end of a couch just levitated into the air. Marcia Lydia Goodin was born full-blooded Seneca on December 28, 1963. She was the youngest of 9 children, and her childhood was more than traumatic, with severe physical abuse, where, among other things, she was often tied to a chair for hours. Shortly after she was brought to the Goodin home, strange things began to happen. First, Jerry and Laura began misplacing personal items, or maybe they just moved all on their own. Then in 1969, a young lady named Rosemarie found herself terrified as the end of the couch that she was sitting on slowly began to vibrate. Jerry and Laura had developed a friendship with another couple named Harold and Mary Hoffman. The Hoffmans would often come to visit. They had a daughter named Rosemarie. When Rosemarie and Marcia first met, they sat on opposite ends of the couch in the living room as the adults played cards in the kitchen. Marcia sat still with her hands folded in her lap and oddly smiling at Rosemarie, when all of a sudden, Rosemarie's end of the couch began to vibrate and then slowly rise. The more afraid that Rosemarie became, the higher her end of the couch rose until it was silently floating a significant distance into the air. Then, with Marcia still coyly smiling at Rosemarie, it gently floated back down. As soon as it was securely on the floor, Rosemarie jumped up and ran to her parents, who just wrote off her frantic cries as a child's ploy for attention. Over the next few months, whenever the Hoffmans would come to visit, the girls were put together and they were told to get along. Oftentimes, Marcia would talk to her stuffed animals, and Rosemarie was amazed and terrified when they would talk back. It wasn't long after this that Jerry and Laura began to hear strange sounds coming from somewhere in the house. The sounds began at night and very quickly became rhythmic. At first, the idea of poltergeist activity didn't even cross Jerry's mind. As the banging continued, he thought, well, maybe it was a particular neighbor that just might have been playing a trick on the family.
They had kids and motorcycles. The noises had a definite pattern and occurred at all hours of the day and night. They would begin as a light tapping and then work up into an awful banging.
Jerry made several complaints to the police department, but no evidence was ever found that this particular neighbor had anything to do with these noises. One of Jerry's friends, John Holsworth, was a police officer, and he suggested that they should make a tape of these noises, and maybe that could better help the police discover the cause. So they set up the recorder and taped these strange sounds throughout the early morning hours and into the day. That morning, these noises started in the kitchen and then actually followed John and Jerry as they moved from room to room. The police department added the recordings to their investigation, and shortly after this, that neighbor that Jerry had suspected of pranking the family, they moved away. And then lo and behold, these noises stopped. And it seemed as if that neighbor had indeed been behind these disturbances. But then eerily, just a short while later, the banging resumed. And this time, it seemed even louder, even more pronounced. Well, this baffled and frustrated the Goodins, and although the idea of poltergeist activity seemed far-fetched, they were now beginning to wonder. Still, Jerry thought that there just had to be some rational explanation.
I checked every piece of metal in this house. I thought an animal was stuck, so I took apart the piping and ductwork in the basement, but I found nothing. The gas company said it may be trapped air or something or another, so we ended up switching to an electric oil-fired furnace.
Eventually, the gas company, the fire department, and other city officials got involved. The basement was checked, the foundation was checked, and even the surrounding neighborhood was checked. They looked into the gas lines, the plumbing, and even geological factors, but nothing was ever found that could account for these noises. After a while, the gas company, the fire department, and the others involved said that they were just confounded, and there was nothing more that they could do. And it looked as if the Goodin family was just destined to suffer these noises indefinitely. And they did suffer them for a while. But then, in 1974, this case escalated when a mysterious, disembodied hand just suddenly appeared outside of the Goodins' window. The supposed poltergeist activity at the Goodin house in 1974 was so intense, so pronounced, that even now, 50 years later, the neighbors are still keenly aware of what happened.
I'm just saying because finding the furniture floating in the midair.
Clearly 966, flip one number upside down and 666.
But it's like you can't make this thing up.
Believe it or not, the pounding at the Goodin house happened so often and so repetitively that over time, the family just accepted it as maybe an unexplained natural phenomenon, a routine, kind of like a train passing by. But then, in the summer of 1974, Jerry and Laura saw what looked like to be a disembodied hand floating right outside of their window. When they went to investigate, no one was there. Shortly after this, the doors started opening all by themselves, and furniture was found across the room from where it had been placed. Then, on Friday night, November 22nd, 1974, a loud crash came from the master bedroom. When the family went to investigate, they found that the window shade had been rolled up and the curtains had mysteriously fallen onto the floor, allowing anyone who was outside to see in. Along with being disconcerting, this was odd because the window was shut. No one could have reached in from the outside and pulled those curtains down. And the curtains had been securely fastened to the wall. Jerry and Laura refastened the curtains and pulled the shade back down. But the curtains flew off the wall again, and then so did the ones in the kitchen. And almost immediately after that, that old familiar banging began again. But this time, it was so loud that the family later described it as ear-splitting and timber shaking, and still it got louder until everyone was aggressively covering his or her ears. And then, just like it always did, it just suddenly stopped and everything was silent. But this time, there was something different, something in the air. Perhaps it was the fact that the curtains had flown off of the windows, making the family feel vulnerable to the outside. Or maybe it was the fact that the banging was much louder, more pronounced, and seemingly more intentional than it had ever been. In any case, whatever it was, everyone later said that from that moment on, it felt as if there was a storm on the horizon.
Sometimes it can get a little weird later at night. I've heard rumors about their address like 996 or 69, something like that. There's a point where the numbers on the address went 666, the devil's number.
On Saturday, November 23rd, 1974, just one day before large crowds would gather outside that home, the Goodins spent the day out, and they returned just before 5 p.m. When they walked in the door, they could feel that something from last night was still in the air, and it wasn't long after that this family could no longer deny that whatever was happening wasn't natural. From about 5 p.m. until 3 in the morning, all manner of chaos broke loose. Dishes came up out of the sink and slammed into the floor. Knives came out of the knife block, hurled themselves at Jerry, and just narrowly missed him as he jumped out of the way. And then the knife block itself, which had been bolted to the wall, ripped itself out of the wood and hurled itself at Jerry. The kitchen table flipped over twice. The refrigerator lifted itself up off of the floor. A heavy wood-encased television slammed into Laura's foot, smashed two of her toes. Another television landed on Marcia's ankle. The activity was so intense that the family huddled together in the living room, arm in arm, shaking until the wee hours of the morning. Now, although these events, if true, were horrifying, up to this point, it really was just the family who had witnessed these crazier parts of the story. And had these events stopped that night, well, then most certainly this whole thing would have went down in history as nothing more than the babblings of three crazy people in Connecticut. But these events didn't stop that night. The very next day, whatever this was that was happening continued, and it was witnessed by dozens of people. And some of those people were police officers. And the police officers later swore out reports that these events were actually happening in that house.
I remember seeing some part of that police report. I remember that, and it was like, you can't believe it. And if you can't believe a sworn police officer on a police report that this thing's ever happened, if you can't believe the police, then what can you believe?
What seemed to be undeniable poltergeist activity had begun on Friday night, November 21st, 1974, when, according to the Goodins, the curtains in their house somehow pulled themselves away from the windows and then slammed onto the floor. Then whatever was happening continued and turned into a full-blown nightmare on Saturday. Well, Sunday morning, things were no better. Furniture was still moving around and wall decor was flying through the air. And the Goodins, not knowing what else to do, they called their friends Harold and Mary Hoffman for help. Harold immediately drove over and Mary called the police. A little past 10 a.m., police officers Carl Leonzi and Joe Tomek pulled up to the house. By this time, Harold Hoffman and a couple other neighbors had already arrived, and later they stated that they themselves had witnessed unexplainable activity while they were there. Well, the officers walked through the house, and at first they thought that it had been ransacked by burglars. But then one of the televisions lifted itself up and then just hung there in midair. Now, this and the following events that I'm about to share were all documented in official police reports. The officers, of course, did a double take at this floating television, and then, I'm guessing, probably terrified, they looked closer for strings or wires or something else that might be holding it up, but they found nothing. As it hung there, they watched as it started to swing like a pendulum, and then, after a moment, it just set itself back down as if nothing had happened. About that time, a second patrol car pulled up, and officers George Wilson and Leroy Lawson entered the house. The four policemen went into the kitchen where Tomek and Leonzi whispered to the two new officers about the floating television. And as the four men were discussing the situation, the refrigerator lifted itself up about 6 inches and set itself back down. Shortly after this, a crucifix ripped itself off the wall and slammed into Officer Lawson's chest. Then he was reported as saying, "That's it, I'm out of here." He left the house and he didn't go back. At some point, Officer Tomek called dispatch and he requested that an ambulance come out for Laura's foot. And he also suggested that the fire department come out and have a look at what was happening because he couldn't make any sense of it himself. Before long, 3 more emergency vehicles pulled up and a total of 10 firemen got involved. Well, by this time, the neighborhood couldn't help but notice all this activity centered around this one little house, and a crowd began to gather outside. Before it was over, there were hundreds, and some reports say thousands, of people on the street. The fire department didn't have any better idea of what to do than the police did. So they ended up calling Father Doyle, the firehouse chaplain. And he came out. He walked through the house, and he said that he definitely felt the presence of evil. He attempted a Catholic ritual using holy water, but the container that the water was in somehow tipped over. So ultimately, he just blessed the house, and he called out an exorcist. To make a long story short, this poltergeist activity continued with many more unexplained events, from evil spirits being seen in the basement to the family cat, Sam, singing Christmas songs. And before long, the house was swarming with all types of people, from paranormal investigators to Catholic priests. And among them was that young seminary student, Paul Eno. And while Paul was there, he felt something that made him believe that this haunting wasn't caused by supernatural evil spirits, but rather parasitic entities from a parallel universe. While this crazy, seemingly paranormal chaos was happening at 966 Lindley Street, one of the people there was Paul Eno. And at one point, while he and several others were in the living room, a large smoky mist began to accumulate in front of them. The mist became a yellowish white mass, and it grew in size until it was about as big as a person. Then it gradually separated into 4 parts, and each part moved with distinction and intelligence until it was clear that there were 4 other conscious beings in the room with everyone else. Paul later said that he watched the demeanor of the people around him change as these entities materialized. Marcia, who was standing next to him, grabbed onto his waist for dear life. Laura, who was sitting in the chair, started crying hysterically. And Jerry, well, he began chanting the Mass of the Dead, which is a chant that's offered up when people die. Jerry's voice changed, it deepened, and for a moment, it looked like something else was in charge of his actions. Paul said that he himself felt a strange rage come over him as one of these misty figures approached him and Marcia. As he got closer, he instinctively moved between it and Marcia to protect her, and when he did, he said that he felt it, and it definitely wasn't what he had expected. Instead of being some spiritual energy of some sort, it had substance. It was physical. He said that it felt bony and bird-like.
I was flattened by what happened on Lindley Street, my first major run-in with poltergeists. That's because the traditional idea of this type of phenomenon seemed completely inadequate. Spirits, demons, Marcia as the agent of R.O.P.E, the ghost of the lost son. None of this was good enough to explain what I saw, heard, and felt that day.
After a bit, these entities dematerialized, and then everyone's normal personalities returned. Later, the paranormal activity in this house died down, and eventually it stopped altogether, seemingly for no reason. In the end, Police Superintendent Joseph Walsh shut the case down, stating that it had all been a hoax orchestrated by Marcia. Of course, not everyone accepted this conclusion. There were just too many things that really seemed to be beyond Marcia's capabilities, like how did she cause the television or the refrigerator to float? Over the years, Paul Eno, he just couldn't stop thinking about what happened that night. And eventually, he and seminary went separate ways. And then he embarked on a 35-year career where he spent his time investigating the paranormal.
As each case came and went, I became more convinced that we are not dealing with servants of Satan, ghosts of upset people, or even scientific explanations of R.O.P.E. What I believe really happened on Lindley Street might reach to the core of what reality really is, and our disconcerting place in it.
After studying hundreds of paranormal cases, Paul came to the conclusion that reality is comprised of a myriad of universes. They're all stacked up on one another, and our universe is just one of them. He believed that all cases of the paranormal, except for ones involving hoaxes, were caused by either universes kind of interacting with one another, or by beings from another universe that had gained the technology and were deliberately crossing from theirs into ours.
Why did so many ghosts I ran into fear the people I was trying to help, thinking that the people were ghost hunting them? Why did so many UFO cases involve ghost sightings and even cryptids in some areas? Why did so many spirits have physical characteristics, some unlike any creatures we know in our world? Why do people sometimes see ghosts of themselves? Why do cases, if an investigator thinks to look, almost always involve multiple homes in the same area? The multiverse theory explained virtually everything, and the paranormal, especially from my perspective, in the trenches.
So, where does the case on Lindley Street fit into Paul's multiverse theory? Well, that just might be the scariest part of this whole thing.
Among the denizens of the multiverse are entities that we call parasites. Somehow these entities can move between parallel worlds and feed upon negative energies produced by humans when in states of anger, fear, hatred, isolation, and other divisive conditions. They often work in packs. They learn quickly. They have leadership, and I've seen them farming individuals, families, and even communities as food sources for sometimes generations. The more they eat, the stronger they get. Given our very limited framework of knowledge, I can see how these parasites easily join human folklore early on as demons, vampires, and even space aliens. The Lindley Street case was, in my opinion, a textbook parasite attack.
If Paul's theory is correct, well, it just might explain what happened on Lindley Street and why it eventually faded into nothing for seemingly no reason. When it all began, the Goodins were in a very powerful state of depression over the loss of their son. And then they adopted a little girl who had suffered severe physical and emotional abuse as a child. According to Paul, the family was ripe for the type of parasitic entities that he describes. But eventually, with the help of the community, the family got a grip on their emotions, making them no longer a viable food source for these types of other dimensional beings. So they moved on. During her research, Amy came across a man who claims that he was there during the height of the Lindley Street haunting, and he saw this activity firsthand. Now, we must warn you that as of the release date of this video, this next segment is highly controversial. It contains an extensive interview that I did with a man who claims that as a child, he spent quite a bit of time at the Goodins' home. He says that Jerry and Laura would occasionally babysit for his mother. I found parts of his interview extremely fascinating. At one point, he even shares the moment that he got possessed by otherworldly entities. And then he talks about how they stayed with him his entire life, encouraging him to engage in nefarious and often violent acts, and then how they would feed off of the negativity that came out of that. It's controversial because this person has a criminal record. He's done things that are unbecoming of a human being. And up until recently, there's been absolutely no reference to him being connected to this case. After hearing his story, some people do believe that he's telling the truth, but others, they say that this man, well, he's just a liar.
I've done extensive research on the Lindley Street case. I've read all the literature on this case, and I've watched and listened to countless content about it. And I've also listened to Joe's story, and I do not believe he was ever at the Goodins' house nor experienced the things he claimed.
Like, this guy is either very well versed in Lindley Street, or this is this little boy, this Joey.
This story has been told and retold, and there's no little Joey in the story. Why should people believe you?
I'm at a point right now where I don't care if people believe me. It's my story, and it's what happened. And that's what I'm here to tell.
But it's been 50 years. You could have come forward at any time. Why wait? Why now?
I was under the control from dark forces, and I didn't get out of this thing until a year ago. And that's when I came forward.
You know, after this report, people are going to look you up and they're going to find out that you have a criminal background, sexual assault on your record. And that's going to affect your credibility with some people. What do you say to those people?
I wasn't a very nice person. I did a lot of terrible things. And I'm not blaming it on anyone but myself. But that's not the person that's sitting before you right now. What happened on Lindley Street happened, and I'm the only one that can tell it. I wish it wasn't me. I wish it didn't happen to me, but it did.
Joseph John Landry was born just a couple of blocks from the Goodin home at St. Vincent's Hospital on August 3rd, 1966. His mother was only 15 years old. She met the Goodins while she was working at their favorite restaurant. Over time, a friendship was created, and occasionally she'd ask them to babysit.
When I used to get within a half a block of this house, the pressure started, the anxiety started. I was like a dog that wanted to get out of the car and run.
Wow. And now here we are, less than 50 feet from the front door. Amy told me that your nightmare began for you when you were just 6 years old during one of your first visits when Laura put you in the bathtub.
So she immediately started filling up the bathtub, put some bubble bath in there, got it about halfway full, and put me in a tub and said, "I'll be right back." As soon as she walked out of the bathroom door, it slammed, and I felt something like a hand pushing my head and holding me under the water. And I was kicking and I was trying to get out, but I was being held down so hard that I passed out. And I woke up on the side of the tub, and Laura had thought I'd gotten out of the tub, slammed the door, went back and slipped and hit my head. That's what she was convinced happened, but that's not what happened.
Later, on another visit, Joey saw something that he couldn't understand. Marcia was in her room, and she called for Joey to come over.
And I made my way over to her bedroom door, and she had all her stuffed animals spread out throughout the floor and said, "Watch this, I can do magic." And she jumped on the bed and she raised her arms up, and all 20 or so of those stuffed animals hit the ceiling. And I just remember looking until she dropped her arms and they all rained down on the carpet. And she said, "See, I can do magic." And she jumped off the bed, and I said, "No, you can't." The door slammed and I heard her voice, but it wasn't her voice. It was a deep voice saying, "Yes, I can." That was the first really supernatural thing I saw in that house.
Joey's mom dropped him off so often that eventually the Goodins got him a small cot to sleep on. One night, while he was sleeping alone in the living room, he felt an overwhelming presence of evil all around him.
And when I opened my eyes, there was nothing but red eyes around me in the dark. And I pulled the covers over my face. I shut my eyes. I lowered the blanket and I opened my eyes, and they went from being in the background to right in front of my face, to where I could smell nothing but like rotting flesh and smelled like rotten eggs. And I heard a voice say, "We've been waiting for you, Joey." But it was thunderous. All of them speaking at the same time, but all of them together like an army. And that's haunted me for every day of my life, because they stayed with me for 50 years and they were waiting for me.
Joey's mom continued to drop off little Joey at the Goodin home, and in the beginning, he was just an outsider looking in. But one day soon, that would change, and Joey, he'd find himself as the victim of demonic possession. One day, while Laura was out hanging laundry, Marcia called to Joey from the basement. Joey walked over to the basement door and looked down the steps.
I'm shaking my head. I didn't want to go down there. I just felt it, something not good coming out of there. And at that moment, something grabbed me from around the waist. And at first, I thought it was Laura. And I got taken down the stairs, and by something I couldn't see. Every time I tried to reach for the railing to stop the momentum, my hand got slapped away from the railing. Again, I didn't see, I couldn't see. I got dropped at the bottom of the stairs, and I saw a black shadow shoot to the corner. And I looked at Marcy, and she said, "They're my friends. They're my family. They want to be your friends. Tell them they can be your friends. Tell them, Joey. Tell them." And I was scared at this point. I wanted to what was happening to stop. So I said it, and then I said it again. And then when I said it again, out of the corner, I saw the thing shoot towards me, and I felt like it was choking me, but it was actually kind of going inside me. Within a minute or two, my eyes went blurry, and I looked, and it just felt like there were several eyes looking with me behind my eyes. I didn't feel alone. From that day forward, those eyes were always looking through my eyes with me.
Joey says that from that day on, these entities that were looking out of his eyes were constantly encouraging him to do horrible things. One day in elementary school, a little girl embarrassed Joey, and these entities told him that what he needed to do was to bring a knife to class the next day. So, early in the morning, he put one in his lunchbox, and then he headed to school.
I put the lunchbox under my desk, an easy grab. And at one point, when the teacher turned around, they all started telling me, "Now, go now, get it out now." And I reached down and grabbed the lunchbox, and I slowly opened it up and took the knife out. And the voices are still telling me, "Now, you're not going to get in trouble, just go now." And I stood up, and they're yelling at me to go now, go now. And I was about to go when to stop the voices from saying it, I screamed, "No, no." And I dropped the knife.
And just so that I'm clear and everybody understands, when you say the voices are saying, go now, they meant for you to go stab that little girl.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. If I didn't scream no, I don't want to say what might have happened, but I think, yeah, it would have happened.
During our interview, Joey explained to me that these entities had the ability to show him scenes from other places and times. Somehow, they could pull him out of his body and then take his soul someplace else. When he was just 10 years old, they showed him something that let Joey understand that these beings, they can actually see the future and manipulate his past.
They took me someplace where we were looking down on two men on the scaffolding. One was an older guy, and the other one looked like he was, barely a teenager. And they passed each other on the scaffold, traded places. Within about 1 or 2 minutes after that, one side of the scaffolding collapsed. The older man fell down to the sidewalk. At that moment, I saw one of these demons swoop down that was in the bunch with me, grab that boy's arm, and put it on the windowsill. And then I saw him punch through the glass and pull himself through. When the young guy pulled himself through the window, the other side collapsed. The whole thing came down on top of the older man who was on the sidewalk, got crushed by the staging he was on.
Now, at this moment, when you're watching this, you really didn't have an idea of what you're watching, right? All you knew is what you're telling me.
Right.
But then later, you kind of did some research, and what did you find out?
I found out that the older man was my grandfather, and the younger boy that was up there was my 16-year-old father. It was 1963. I wasn't even born yet. They saved my father's life because they needed me.
What do you mean they needed you?
I was in their plan somehow of things that I was supposed to do and people that I was supposed to affect.
Negatively.
Yes.
These supernatural things kept happening to Joey, and he found that over time it became harder and harder to resist these negative forces behind his eyes. So one day when he was 18, he decided that he was going to remove himself from their control. It was a nightmare, and he was no longer going to be a part of it. So he took a knife and he cut open his wrist. But just moments before he died, someone found him, and after a 2-day recovery, he was taken to Bridgeport State Mental Hospital in Massachusetts for psychiatric evaluation. When he got there, he was taken to the common room, where, as he tells it, it was filled with unstable people, some talking to themselves, some laughing, some crying for no reason. Just moments after he arrived, a man across the room started staring at Joey, and then he slowly began to make his way over.
The closer we got, a smile started to appear, and I could see he was looking at me. Didn't say anything for maybe 15 seconds. We had a look, and he looks me in the eye and he says, "We always win, Joey. We always win." And he turned around and started shuffling away from me, and I just hear him start laughing hysterically.
Joey was in the hospital for about a month. When he left, he had a renewed spirit to fight, but it wasn't easy. He constantly found himself surrounded by paranormal activity, and he was continually being encouraged to do wrong. Many unexplainable things happened during this time. Things like when he was viewing a still image of his grandmother's house on the computer in 2008.
I zoom into the third floor where it was my father's bedroom when he was a boy, and it was my bedroom when my grandmother adopted me. And I see someone sitting in a chair. So as I'm staring at it more and more, I see what looked like the face press up against the glass and then sit back like this. And I said, okay, I'm staring at the screen too hard, and my eyes are making me see things that I'm not seeing. And so I relaxed them, and then I looked again, and it went from that to someone rocking in a rocking chair like this. And then all of a sudden, he would do this again at the window. But now as I'm concentrating, I can see he sees me looking at him. And I could tell that he's staring at me and I'm staring at him. So at this point, I see it stand up and I see it passing, walking back and forth in front of the window impatiently. And I just could not figure out why I knew what it was, but why?
These types of eerie, mysterious events happened a lot. Sometimes he'd understand them, and sometimes he wouldn't. But all the while, he'd also have to fight those voices telling him to do terrible things. For the most part, he was able to put those ideas out of his mind. But then, in 2023, he gave in, and he almost killed his neighbor.
I want my audience to understand. Deep inside you, there was this rage. It had never left you, right? So not only did strange things happen around you, but there was also this inner fight that you had going on as well, right?
Right.
And then in 2023, something pretty intense happened, right?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
I was just washing dishes at the front sink when I felt something as if a storm was coming. And it was at that time that as I'm washing my dishes, I can see the front of my house. I see my neighbor across the street's blinds move like that. And he looked out. Whether he saw me, washing my dishes, I don't know. A couple of minutes later, I'm going outside, and he is yelling about the cats. And he kept, I'm going to end up killing them. They come in my yard. And it was at that point I heard, now, go, now. And I ran in the house and grabbed a big knife, looked like a machete. I come running out of my house. I leap off of 4 stairs like I'm a 16-year-old kid again and run across the yard at full blast. He sees me coming with this big knife, and he backs up, trips over his feet. He goes on his back. And I was just about standing over him with this big knife at that point, and all I saw was me on top of him, stabbing this man, and me looking back at me, watching with a smile in the eyes of a demon, and just smiling. And it was me, and it was what was supposed to happen. I felt his hand on my shoulder, and it brought me back. It was my friend next door, and he said, Joe. And I remember calling Tony Sparrow and Judy that night. I owe them so much. I really do, because I was at the end, and I don't know if I was going to make it by myself. I just needed help.
What did they do to help you?
It was decided right there and then that after Tony got me calmed down, that we're going to get this. We're going to get this now. We can't wait any longer. We can't. Never mind all the other stuff. And he got a hold of Archbishop Plato Angelescus, who is an exorcist priest from Canada.
The exorcism took place at Joey's home. A priest named Father James stood with Joey in his bathroom. Another priest, Archbishop Plato from Canada, joined in through speakerphone. The room was prepared with various religious items. The tub was filled, and Joey was placed under the water, face up, and he was told to stay under the water as long as he could. During the exorcism, the most peculiar thing happened. These entities, they told Joey they loved him.
I was being held and stroked and hugged and pleading, we love you, Joey. Don't do this. You will have nobody. We're your family. We love you. It was the first time.
So wait a minute. So the demons,
yes,
are hugging you spiritually.
Yeah,
they're saying, "We love you. We're your family.
Don't let us go."
Don't you think that's a little ironic? Because didn't Marcia say, "They're my family"? Doesn't it get the hairs on the back of your neck to stand up?
But I almost believed them, because they were.
But you almost didn't go through with it,
right? Because I was afraid to let them go and have nothing. They made me feel like if I let them go, no one's going to love you anymore, Joey. No one's going to understand you. No one's going to give you a break. Everything they said almost swayed me to no, I can't. You're right. You're all I got. They were tricking me. They were trying, and they almost succeeded.
Joey later told me that he felt like if he let them go, then he would be completely alone. And he said that was one of the scariest feelings he has ever had. At some point in this confusion, he heard a voice coming from the bathroom saying, "Now, Joey, now, with all of your might." And he redirected his thoughts, and he resisted their lies. And as he did, these voices in his head, they began to fade.
And I felt them leaving, but the last one, as he left, said, "We'll be back. We'll be back."
But you felt it go. You felt it go away.
Felt them go.
And they were gone.
Yeah.
Right. And then you come up out of the water.
Yeah.
What happens?
It almost felt like there was such an inner peace that I didn't know if I was being tricked or not. It was just are they hiding? After I come out of this, I was always thinking that they're hiding, but I knew there was nothing else looking through my eyes anymore. And, Father Plato said to me, after I got all the fuzziness and the echoes and stopped rocking back and forth. He said, "How do you feel?" And I said, "Empty. I feel empty." And he just started laughing. He says, "Well, we got to keep it that way."
So it sounds like these things feed on negative emotions.
Very much.
Is that how you see it?
Yes, because it would not allow me to feel anything else for the most part. If I did, I felt like I was doing something wrong.
Right. So I gotta say, your story sounds fantastical. It's hard to believe. You have to admit, if this didn't happen to you, and somebody came up and told you that their whole life they had been possessed, I guess for lack of a better word, by evil spirits, and you had never experienced anything like that, you would have a difficult time believing it, wouldn't you?
Yes, I would. That's why I bear no bad judgment on anyone that doesn't believe me, because it does sound too fantastic, too impossible. If you want to believe my story, feel free to. If you want to say that it's not true, that's your choice. But as I sit here right now, I tell you every word of it is true.
When we reached out to Joey and we were trying to get this interview set up, Joey told us that the only way he would do it is if we allowed him to share his message of hope. He said that he knows that there are others out there who are fighting demonic possession, and he wants them to know that they're not alone. And if they just reach out, people will help. Then they'll find victory.
It's been 50 years since you've been here.
Yes.
As you look at the house, what goes through your mind?
A sense of victory.
Wow.
I finally won a battle that took 50 years of my life, and I am not afraid. I feel nothing coming off that house. It's nothing there anymore.
So, did the haunting on Lindley Street really happen, or was it just a hoax? Well, today, 50 years later, most of the world believes that it indeed was a hoax and that it was orchestrated by Marcia. Personally, I find that explanation difficult to accept. She was only 10 years old, and she would have had to have fooled dozens of people, including police officers. Some say that it was a hoax orchestrated by the entire family, but that explanation is challenging as well, as several honorable individuals came forward and they stated that Jerry and Laura were people of strong integrity. And the story doesn't really easily fit into the traditional hauntings either. In cases like this, one expects to find some horrific event in the home's past, like with the house at Amityville. According to police records, Butch DeFeo slaughtered his entire family, and then from that day forward, the house was haunted. Or the Villisca Axe murder house in Iowa, where an intruder snuck in and murdered that family, and then that house became haunted. But such isn't the case with the house on Lindley Street. Seemingly, there was no horrific event before the haunting, and then the poltergeist activity just vanished into nothingness. Maybe Paul's theory is right. What about Joseph Landry? Well, as I stated when I began that interview with him, this story has been around for 50 years. There's never been a little Joey in the story. Even the author of the book, The World's Most Haunted House, William Hall, said that while he was researching the story, he did not come across any information on a little boy named Joey. But then again, there wouldn't necessarily be any records or documentation that Joey was ever there. According to Joe, the Goodins would just babysit for his mother from time to time. Interestingly, while researching, Amy found that Joe had been on a couple other YouTube channels telling his story, and in the comments section of those channels, people attacked him. That's why he was reluctant to come on our show. Although nearly all of the comments were from people who stated that they believed that Joey was a liar, one comment stood out. From the YouTube channel Albert Sanders 3801, someone wrote that their niece showed them the video, and they got chills. They said that they remembered that little boy named Joey, and that Joey was evil and gave their son a bloody nose. Well, If that's true, it would seem to confirm that Joey was at least there. We looked up Albert's YouTube channel, and it's been around for over 10 years, but we didn't find an email address, so we couldn't email them and confirm their comment. In the end, we leave it up to you to believe or disbelieve Joey's story. Amy looked into ancient writings, and she actually found that there are otherworldly entities that have been around for thousands of years, and they feed on negative emotions.
We'll do it. So, what do you have for us today?
Okay, well, I looked into some information in some ancient Vedic texts.
Okay.
And these things go back 3,500 years, right? And there's mention of an entity called the Pisacha. And I found it very interesting because in Hindu and Buddhist mythology, the Pisacha are actually considered a physical manifestation of pure evil.
Wow.
Yeah. So some people say, well, they're
so they're not filled with evil. They are evil.
Evil.
Like you can't separate it.
Right.
They are what makes evil.
Absolutely. And as I read about these entities, I could not help but draw parallels to what Paul Eno said. When he talked about these parasites feeding off negative energy. Well, guess what? Pisacha, that's their main meal. They feed on negative emotions like fear, anxiety, apprehension, anger. And that was all over the Goodin household, right?
Yes.
They were in massive state of negativity.
Yes.
And with Pisacha, they reap, I guess they sow the seeds of negativity and reap the benefits. So the more negative emotion, right? Think about it. The worse things got, the more crazy things got, the more upset, sad, crying, fearful the Goodins and visitors got. Well, that energy just makes them stronger.
Wow.
Right? They feed on that.
So what about when Paul said he could feel them, though? These things you're talking about, they're in mythology, right? So they're spiritual. What about the stuff like Paul said he could touch them?
Right. Yeah. So Pisacha actually have a form where they are smoky, but they also have a bony, tall, thin skeletal structure.
Bony? You said bony.
I said bony, which matches exactly what Paul said when he touched the parasite.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're multidimensional.
Really?
Yes. So they can move in between. And another connection that I made was, I think Paul said that this smoky mass kind of divided into four and they work together.
Yeah.
Well, the Pisacha work well in groups. They can follow leadership. Very good kind of on a battlefield situation. Yeah. And I was thinking, oh my gosh.
And these things were written about 3,500 years ago?
Right. And people still believe in these entities today. In fact, I looked into kind of some more recent thinking in this area. And there are those who say, you actually need to do this and this and this to get rid of them. Because if you get a Pisacha, that energy anywhere in your family, you're in big trouble.
So then, I don't know what they said to do, but if you were able to be positive and not be afraid and not be upset for a long enough period of time, would they just go away?
Right. That's part of it. Yeah. Being positive is part of it. They don't have anything to feed on if there's no negativity, negative energy, stress. Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So as I always do, I have to ask you, what did you think about the story itself? We'll talk about Joe in a second, but what did you think about the story?
I think something definitely happened at the Goodins that was paranormal, otherworldly. If you look at the police officers that made statements, Joe Tomek comes to mind. I found that he was interviewed by Paul Eno years and years and years and years later.
Yeah.
And he said, I absolutely believe that there was something going on there. I don't know if it's ghosts. I don't know if it's, otherworldly creatures, but it was something. It wasn't human interference.
And he filled out the police report stating that the TV was floating right in front of him.
Right.
Swinging like a pendulum.
Right. And officers actually asked to be blessed by the chaplain and Father Doyle before they left, because they were afraid whatever was going on there was going to follow them to their home.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
And so, what is your take on this Joey guy? He's not been around forever, and he just comes out a year ago, and he's like, "No, I was there."
Right.
What do you think?
Well, okay. I've thought a lot about why the author didn't put anything about Joey in his book.
Well, the author didn't know anything about Joey.
Right. And if you think about it, if I'm the Goodins, this is my home.
Yeah.
And we're doing interviews later, I'm not going to bring up a little boy that I was babysitting, because the family is troubled, right?
Yeah.
Joey came from a very troubled environment.
Yes.
And as the homeowner, or as the babysitter, I guess as the mama hen, I don't want to bring anything onto that family, right? This is kind of my thing going on.
Yeah.
So that's how I feel about that. I cannot say definitively he was there.
Of course.
I have no absolute evidence.
Yeah. The only person that knows if he was there was Joey.
Right. And the Goodins.
Well, they're not here
they're
anymore,
gone.
right?
Right.
So it's just Joey.
Yeah.
So if I read you right, you're saying that you believe that something, you don't know what, did take place, something supernatural, at the Goodins' house.
Absolutely.
And you think that Joey might have been, he might have known the Goodins. Maybe stayed there.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you again.
You're welcome.
This was our very first in-person interview, and if you've watched this video all the way up to this point, well, we're jazzed about that. Please know that it is our intention to create more content like this, where we go on location and we interview people who claim to have been directly involved in yet-to-be-explained events, and currently the only thing keeping us from doing so are the funds. But as this channel grows and it begins to create solid revenue, I promise you we will be putting our resources in that direction. So if you like this channel, please share it with everyone else who you think would also like it, and comment and like. Those things really help out the algorithm. As far as this report goes, it really reminds me of the Bell Witch. In the 1800s, a family was tormented by an evil spirit that nearly drove the family crazy by producing loud banging sounds all over the house. And just like with this story, it wasn't only the family who witnessed these paranormal activities. Several members of the community also swore that while they were in the house, they too experienced supernatural events. Unlike this story, the evil spirit in that one actually killed one of the family members. It is a very fascinating story. We did a complete report on it, and if you'd like to see it, it's here.
I do hope that you enjoyed this report. I continue to hunt for new stories all the time.
Yes, and if you haven't gotten any merch yet, she designs it all, and it's at Fourth Wall, and we've got some amazing stuff. Check it out.
You said check it out.
Oh,